Good, still morning, everybody. It is January 27th, 2020. This is a regular meeting of the City of Eugene Planning Commission. We'll go ahead and start off with the public comment. The Planning Commission reserves 10 minutes at the beginning of this meeting for public comment. The public may comment on any manner except items scheduled for public hearing or public hearing items for which the record has already closed. So I'm going to go ahead. I've got Ed McMahon, who has requested to speak. Come on up, Ed. If you would give us your name and your address and go ahead and let us know what you'd like to say.
Good day, Commissioners. Ed McMahon, Executive Director of the Home Builders Association of Lane County, 1065 River Road. You know, I certainly understand the difficulty of trying to turn the code into a clear and objective track. The process requires really getting into the detail and then trying to balance various opinions that range from one end of the spectrum to the other. And progress has been made, but I don't think we're quite there yet. One thing I am certain of is that the majority of this community wants to densify within the existing urban growth boundary before we expand that boundary. What I'm beginning to see with the clear and objective cleanup is a choice between open space, trees, and housing. You've already seen an example where a PUD lost 7 lots due to the open space requirements. That's been sent to you previously. We already have stormwater that are reducing the amount of lots within a subdivision. So stormwater, open space, trees, just how much buildable land inventory within our UGB are we not able to develop on before we expand that boundary? Maybe it's time to take a closer look at the balance between the conflicting values, open space, trees, and housing. When it comes to the tree issue, we would like for mitigation to be the answer, but I understand it's not off the table, just won't be part of the clear and objective cleanup, and I look forward to hearing staff's report about that. Do know that a group of us are getting together to discuss the new version, and we hope to meet with staff very soon so you'll know our concerns. But for now, I look forward to hearing the staff report, and thank you for your service.
Great. Great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so for today's agenda, I'm going to go ahead and let Janessa lead us through the process. What we're going to do is we're going to focus on, there's 3 areas that the City Council sent back to us, and I'll let Janessa kind of go into all those details. But I do just want to kind of, she's also going to talk about where we are in the process so that we kind of have an understanding of where the opportunities for the public to continue to weigh in and all of that is. So I'll go ahead and kick it over to Janessa, and I'll chime in periodically probably. So
thank you.
Thank you.
So good morning. I'm Janessa Dragovich, Senior Planner and the Project Manager for the Clear and Objective Update. To my left is Alyssa Hansen, Planning Director. So last May, City Council gave us approval to move forward with the proposed code amendments, on to formal adoption, but with the instruction to revisit a few topics with you first. So today we're here to go over the revised draft tree preservation standards and discuss a few remaining issues called out specifically by Council. So before we get started, I wanted to give you a short project refresher since it's been a while since I've been here. Oh yeah, and let me know if you can't hear me. So you may remember that the state law requires us to have clear and objective standards for land use application types that involve housing. So that's land divisions, planned unit developments or PUDs, conditional uses, and site reviews. The goal of the Clear and Objective project is to improve both efficiency and effectiveness of our clear and objective process. We can achieve this by adopting changes that mitigate barriers to housing, increase efficiency and predictability in the application review process, and effectively address development impacts with our adopted requirements. So the Clear and Objective project was initially designed to allow intentionally designed to allow incremental review from the public, planning commission, and council. This diagram you've seen several times before, and it shows the project phases. So just to recap on what we've done, we identified our key issues in phase 1 and came up with the preferred concepts for addressing those issues in phase 2. And then we proposed code changes and drafted language to implement the approved concepts in phase 3. And then at this point, we're moving into phase 4, the formal adoption process. However, we're circling back with you on these items that council called out. So it's important to remember as you review and refine the draft tree standards language today that there will be opportunities over the next several months for public comment on all of the proposed changes through the formal adoption process. You'll have more chances still to refine the amendments after the public weighs in. So the goal today is to make sure the structure and overall content is at a good starting point. So, I guess my request or what I put out there is that maybe look at it at that level and not get too weighed down on specific numbers unless you think that they're not good starting points. But consider that you're going to hear from several people probably on fine-tuning some of those. Once we get through these and you feel comfortable with the language that we have, then the Planning Commission will hold a public hearing, followed by probably multiple deliberations to further refine and ultimately recommend code language to council. Then once you make the recommendation to council, they will hold a public hearing and deliberate before they take action.
Can I ask a quick question?
Oh, sure.
Before you move on?
Sure.
When is that anticipated? When do you have in your kind of tentative schedule when the hearing process?
There's still some question about dates because it's hard to predict since we won't be going to council for several months because we need to get through the public hearing process with can I bring up the mid-April is looking like a potential time for the public hearing if we get through get the code to the point that you guys are comfortable with them moving forward. And we do have, I'll plug this now, I was going to mention it later, but we have today's meeting and then we do have a February 11th work session scheduled just in case today's not enough to get through the 4 topics. Perfect. So of the 37 original key issues identified in phase 1, approved recommendations for 30 of the items require land use code changes in order to implement. So this includes a few action items also that were identified as part of the Housing Tools and Strategies project. After releasing the draft code language for comment, we reviewed all proposed changes with you to make sure that you agreed that the structure and draft language generally hit the mark based on the approved concepts that we developed in phase 2. This evaluation recognized the iterative process with remaining chances to refine the exact language as part of the formal adoption. So most of the proposed changes you supported unanimously in straw polls. A few of the items generated more discussion, and we shared those concerns and feedback when we went to council last May. There were 4 items that you didn't support unanimously that council wanted us to revisit with you prior to launching the formal adoption. These are described in your agenda packet. Attachment A contains the revised draft tree preservation standards, and Attachment C provides the short summaries. I think maybe, let me correct that. Attachment B has the tree code. And then Attachment C provides short summaries of each of the remaining items beyond trees. And then Attachment A was a summary that I had provided to council of your feedback from when we were discussed the changes before. So the first item relates to, as Ed mentioned too, to one of the biggest undertakings during the draft code writing phase, addressing tree preservation in a clear and objective way. The existing requirement was identified as not being effective, as we currently only require a report from an arborist or landscape architect showing that consideration, and typically I air quote that, consideration, was given to tree preservation. The approved concept was to implement a tree rating scale and set a minimum level of preservation with an allowance for some mitigation. The takeaway from your previous discussion on the first draft of code amendments was that while most of you could support the general direction, you wanted more time to work with the language and had concerns based on the overall complexity of the rating system, a tree tagging requirement that could add a cost burden, the lack of options or choices for applicants, and that the proposed mitigation or replanting ratio was too high. That's why council amended their motion in May to move the amendments forward with the caveat that we first revisit with you to reflect, or revise them to reflect your concerns and revisit it with you. So the revised language we'll be reviewing today replaces the complex rating system with a much simpler method to meet the minimum, or to obtain the minimum preservation requirement. The tagging requirement has been removed. We added a tree preservation area alternative and adjusted the mitigation ratio. We also substantially increased the list of trees that can be used for replacement planting under the mitigation option to provide more flexibility in it. So before we dig into the code language, I think it's helpful if I give you a quick overview of the structure of the tree preservation standards. So if an applicant chooses the clear and objective track, the first step is to determine whether they meet any of these exceptions. So there's an exception if you are outside of the South Hills area and the lot is under 20,000 square feet, that the standards wouldn't apply. There's an exception if you have 5 or fewer existing significant trees on site to begin with, or an exemption if you're zoned R1.5, which is our row house zone, and that is only located in one small area of Eugene where there's that existing zone, but they're very small lots, so that's why they were pulled out. So then we came up with 2 kind of options for addressing tree preservation. So the first option requires a tree preservation and removal plan. This option might be better for smaller or infill developments. As I mentioned, we broke the complex rating system down into a much simpler one. The minimum preservation requirement is based on the location of the development site. Specifically, there are 3 distinct location categories. We have, the first one is outside of the South Hills area. This is the lowest preservation level in the table that we'll go over. Then the next location category is within the South Hills area between 500 feet and 900 feet elevation, and that's kind of the middle level of preservation requirement. And then finally within the South Hills at or above 900 feet elevation, where there's the highest visual impacts, that has the highest preservation requirement. So under this option, applicants have an arborist or a landscape architect do a detailed accounting of trees. So each tree is identified, measured, and designated for either preservation, mitigation, or removal. And mitigation is only allowed if it's under 900 feet elevation. So that's another component of the above 900 feet elevation where we tighten the standards. And that's in part to keep in consistent with the goals of the South Hills study. So the second option is in response to wanting an alternative for larger sites with lots of trees, where a tree-by-tree inventory can be very costly. For this option, the applicant commits to preserving existing trees on the development site by setting aside 1 or more tree preservation areas. So since a tree-by-tree accounting is not necessarily required and the standards can't require staff discretion, to make the requirement clear and objective, an arborist or landscape architect must certify that the preservation requirement is being met. This is similar to the geotechnical certification that allows the design professional to use methods, and it allows the design professionals to use methods that are acceptable in the industry, but not necessarily clear and objective enough for staff to use. So also, if the tree preservation area option is chosen, then, and you're preserving areas, then the mitigation allowance is not available. And we don't distinguish under the plan, or under the tree preservation area option, we don't distinguish those location categories that I mentioned in the other option. I'm about to talk a lot about DBH, diameter breast height. And so to get us all on the same page, this is just a simplified graphic to show you how DBH is measured. And I'm going to, because I stumble a lot over saying diameter breast height, I'm going to refer to it as DBH. So basically, you go from the base of the tree up 4.5 feet, and you measure the circumference of the tree there, and then you divide it by pi, or 3.14, and that's how you determine what the diameter at breast height is. So I also wanted to walk you through some examples to kind of give you a little context before we look at language. Here we're looking at a pretend 6-lot subdivision with 10 trees, and for simplicity, they are all 10-inch DBH. We're also assuming this development site is in the South Hills, but under 900 feet, so their minimum preservation requirement is 50% of the DBH on site. Since we used nice numbers, that means that there's 100 inches of DBH on the site to begin with. Half of that, or 50 inches of DBH, is the minimum preservation requirement. Since this site is under 900 feet elevation, they can mitigate up to half of that. So basically, 5 trees can be removed outright, and of the remaining 5 trees, at least 3 would be preserved and up to 2 could be mitigated. This is the same plot, but here's how that could look. So notice that there's 4 existing trees that are problematic based on their location in the access area or located more central to a developable lot. So those 4 we chose to remove. I picked the 3 trees located nearest interior property lines to be preserved, and then 2 to potentially be mitigated. I also showed gray circles around the preservation trees. If you can see those, they're pretty faint. But I wanted to add the circles to remind everybody that when you do preserve a tree, you also have to preserve the critical root zone. So if you have a 10-inch tree, you've got a 15-foot radius or critical root zone area that you're also impacting the developability of the lot. So now we're going to look at a more real-world example because trees are not usually quite so uniform. Hold on, I think I got a slide out of place here. Okay. So this is a similar 6-lot subdivision. Looks pretty similar to the pretend one. This time the trees vary in type and size, and this site is outside of the South Hills, and so the minimum preservation is 40% of the DBH. So based on the sizes of the trees, and I realize that you cannot probably read those dimensions that are on there, but the sum total of the existing trees on site came up to 160 inches in DBH. So 40% of that is 64 inches of DBH minimum preservation, and then up to 32 inches of that can be mitigated since it's outside of the 900-foot South Hills area. There may be multiple ways that a developer can meet the requirements. So this is only one option, but in this one we showed that there are 2 large fir trees that are proposed to be preserved for a total of 46 inches diameter breast height preservation. There's a maple that's 36 inches with an X on it in that bottom right lot. That one is proposed to be removed because logistically that would be difficult to build around with the access there. And then there are 2 trees in the hash-marked area, which is a utility easement, that will be problematic as well. So those are the 3 trees that we selected to be removed. And then the remaining trees, the mitigation tree was this blue hexagon up on the middle lot on the top row. And that one as well, especially when you consider the critical root zone and the fact that that access easement will actually have a 10-foot front yard setbacks that will determine where the house could be located, that tree would be a difficult one to preserve. So that's why we chose to mitigate that one. So because that tree is 28 inches in diameter and the mitigation is up to 32 inches, that kind of uses up their mitigation allowance on this one. So that's a workable plan under the scenario that's proposed in the draft code language. You can see how even in this example, coming up with reasonable requirements to suit many circumstances is not easy. But from our analysis, this approach will likely yield fairly similar results as the discretionary track, although the discretionary track can vary widely because there is discretion. The only tree preservation in this actual subdivision was the 18-inch fir tree on the far right on Lot 4. And then there were some replacement plantings required. But just to give you an idea of what we actually achieved out of the discretionary track with tree preservation on this one. So this is a super simplified example, tight, of a larger site with a lot of trees to demonstrate the tree preservation area alternative. It's a lot harder because I think that this will be more favorable for very large sites, and so coming up with one to demonstrate was more difficult. Under this alternative, though, the applicant could preserve these two clusters, for example, by dedicating the red outlined areas. And forgive me, I don't have AutoCAD, so this is Excel trying to come up with this. The applicant could preserve those two areas, though, by dedicating the red outlined areas for preservation. So an arborist or landscape architect would need to certify that at least 50% of the existing DBH is preserved within these two areas. Notice, too, that the preservation areas must include the critical root zones of the trees within it. So now we can look at the draft code language, and I'll walk you through a section at a time, and we can stop if there's a need to open discussion as we go along.
Really quick, I do have Commissioner Taylor in the queue. I don't know if you want to ask a question or should you
Wait till the end.
Okay.
Whatever works best for you guys.
We do it like she was suggesting
Yep.
as we go forward.
We can do that.
Okay. With this, I'm going to pull up a different program. So the first, in your attachment B, I added the definition of significant tree, even though we're not proposing any change to this definition, but because it's so relevant to the tree standards, I wanted to make sure it was readily accessible for you. So significant trees, just to remind everybody, is a living standing tree having a trunk with a minimum cumulative diameter breast height of 8 inches, or when there are multiple trunks having a minimum cumulative diameter breast height of 8 inches, considering the two largest trunks measured at 4.5 feet above mean ground level at the base of the trunk or trunks. So that's the DBH there, is as measured 4.5 feet above. So the first section, as we move into the actual draft standards, subsection 2, the first paragraph, we did add a little bit of language at the very beginning just to clarify that unless they're exempt and no permit for a development activity subject to this section can be approved until the applicant demonstrates compliance with the standards. So that's kind of my first little grade chunk, if there's any questions on that.
Exemptions.
Oh.
I'm just curious about the 20,000 square feet. Where does that come from?
So do you want to, can we go through the next
I'm
chunk?
sorry.
And
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
I'll try to pay better attention.
two chunks away.
2 more chunks to go. I'm so eager. Darn it.
So any questions on the language that we have there? It's a pretty minor change. We took out the subsection A that was this is where you see the previous, the materials submitted shall reflect that consideration has been given. So we're removing the language that we previously had, and then just modifying slightly the introduction.
Any questions, comments on that part?
Okay, so then subsection A, this we added for clarity. This comes up as far as, where the South Hill study actually applies. And this just removes any ambiguity from the clear and objective track by really specifically calling out exactly where we implement the South Hill study. Any questions about that? Okay, so subsection B Commissioner Ramey, is where the exemptions are. So any one of these of the following would constitute an exemption. So the first one is the 20,000 square foot or less limit. And that 20,000 square feet, to answer your question, came from, again, this is a starting point. We expect that we're going to get feedback. I expect that you will hear from people when we open it up for public comment and go through the public hearing process. So this was staff's best starting point, and we picked this number in part because it matches well with the existing exemptions. So 20,000 square feet is a cutoff within Chapter 9, and an exemption or list of exemptions in there, as well as in Chapter 6 tree removal permits. There's also an exemption on 20,000 square feet. So that was why we chose that one. Although we did tailor it so that it's only if you're outside of the South Hills area, so that we are still being a little bit more preservationist within the South Hills area.
And there's no way to know how many possible developable properties would fall in this. And that's just like too much research and data.
I could check with our GIS people and see if they could come up with some figures on that.
Maybe a whole bunch at 15 or a whole bunch at 30.
I'd be curious about that too, actually. Just what are we looking at that, does that even?
Kind of quantifying
Yeah.
how many properties might be exempt.
Because it seems like a pretty small piece of property. So I just don't know if pretty much anything that we're talking about would even be exempt.
Yeah, it's a little less than half an acre. So it's a decent sized lot, but it's not huge.
Okay. Commissioner Fragla.
How big are the R1.5 lots for the townhouses?
500 square feet?
Yeah, they're under 2,500 square feet, I think. Some of them, I
Yeah.
think, maybe can even get down to 16, but I can't remember. They're small,
Okay.
much smaller than this.
Just gives me a range to think about with that 20,000.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Commissioner Baker?
Yeah, I was wondering if when you came back with the amount of lots, you could have a little table that showed the maximum, minimum number of lots that you could get on that, if it was an R.
With the 20,000, you mean
Yeah,
with the
just,
20,000 square foot?
Because if it's that, if you could get 5 actual R1 lots or whatever it is on it, or what the maximum, minimum,
So 4,500 square feet is the minimum lot size for R1 properties. So with a 20,000 square foot, you're looking at 4 or fewer, yeah.
and what the maximum lot size is too, right? Isn't there a maximum lot size?
13,500.
So you could have that range, and that might be helpful just to see what that means.
Sure, okay. Okay. I might follow up with you after too to make sure I'm getting what you want on that. So then the next exemption is if there, we wanted to acknowledge that some sites don't have trees to be preserved. And so if there are 5 or fewer significant trees on the development site prior to development, then that would be an exemption. And that would be no matter where you are. That one's not location specific. And then the R1.5 zone. Any other questions on the exemptions?
Just a question, getting to the 5 or fewer. How many trees can you remove without?
So currently, if you are over 20,000 square feet, you can remove 5 per calendar year. Or if you remove more, then you need a tree removal permit. If you're under 20,000 square feet, it depends. It depends on if there's a house, if there's not a house on the property, then you can't remove anything unless it's dead, diseased, or dying.
And the reason I ask that is if you had a 20,000 square foot lot with 7 trees on it, you could cut 3 of the trees and then you'd be exempt before you came in for your subdivision. Just.
Commissioner Baker?
Yeah, and my question was just about that's not affected if you're above 900 feet either? This particular exemption?
Correct.
Okay, yeah. That's, and does that still comply with the language of the South Hills study?
I mean,
So you're exempt from tree preservation?
if there's 5 or fewer significant trees on the site, then that's not very many trees that you're
Just
looking at.
If it was a property above 900 feet, you know, given that we have these tiered standards, I wasn't sure what the requirements would be above that.
Okay. That could be an amendment to a proposed amendment to change that to also not apply in the South Hills or over 900 feet if you want to address that.
Well, the South Hills study does treat things above 900 feet differently from the other.
They do, but they don't specifically talk about tree
Right, I'm just saying there is a distinction.
permits. So, yeah. They're intended to be protected from an intensive level of development.
No other questions on that section?
Okay?
Proceed.
So then we move to subsection C, and this is where the actual standards really kick in. So this is talking about the minimum tree preservation requirement. So significant trees must be protected and preserved in accordance with this table, and this is the table that breaks down the location categories that I talked to you about in the presentation. So outside of the South Hills area, the minimum preservation would be 40% of the existing diameter breast height of significant trees, and then 50% if you're between 500 and 900 feet within the South Hills area, and then 60% if you're over at or above 900 feet elevation in the South Hills area. And the caveat there is that there's no mitigation allowed if you're over 900 feet, which is called out in the code in a later section. The idea is that these areas are delineated on a tree preservation and removal plan, and that there's a table provided that itemizes each of the trees based on the location category. So we would be looking for developers to address each of those 3 areas in the case that you have a property that spans, from 500 to 900 plus feet. You may have 3 different preservation requirements based on each specific area. But it's a simpler method to measure the sum total DBH within each area, and then your preservation minimum, and then whether or not you're doing mitigation. So it's very methodical how you get there. So the tree preservation removal plan has kind of 3 components. There'd be a table organized by the location category. So that's kind of subsection A, talks about what the table should look like. Subsection B talks about the site plan and what the site plan would actually show on it, the locations of the significant trees and their critical root zones, and whether the tree is to be preserved, removed, or mitigated. And then we want to see the location of existing or proposed utility easements, driveways. As you saw in the examples that I provided, those can definitely impact whether a tree is even possible to preserve with a given design. We'd also ask that the location of all proposed development on the site be shown, and the proposed lot or parcel boundaries, so in the case of subdivisions or partitions. And then that anything that the site plan would also delineate kind of the areas below 500 feet, and then between 500 and 900 feet, and then above 900 feet. So we would see those 3 location categories represented visually. And then the third component of the tree preservation and removal plan is the certification or statement by the landscape architect or arborist that prepares it, that the plan meets the preservation requirements of the code. Any questions about the tree preservation and removal plan?
Okay, I have some, and I'll put myself in the queue last. So Commissioner Fragola, then Commissioner Taylor.
So under 2B, where mitigation is not available for significant trees located on portions of the development site at or above 900 feet in elevation. If,
We haven't quite.
We haven't gotten there.
I'm holding it until after.
oh, I thought we went to that
Sorry.
section. All right,
'Cause
I
have
will
some for
hold
that
it.
too.
Sorry, my gray did not show, I tried to block
Thanks.
out with some gray here so we could see where we were. So I kind of brought us up to this subsection C of section 1.
Okay, great. I will hold.
Okay. Commissioner Taylor, go ahead.
So I'm gonna start by saying that I have heard some statistics that actually are urban forests. Portland has in terms of ratio, a more higher number of trees or more robust urban forest than the city of Eugene, yet it's very dense. So what we've got in front of us, and actually I think Mr. McMahon actually identified it, is really balance, right? So my curiosity, so what I'm looking for is, do we have a code that really encourages housing? We want it built, encourages supporting a UGB, encourages a vibrant, urban forest. That doesn't necessarily mean that that tree that's sitting in the middle of a lot that makes it undevelopable is viable, right? And trees don't necessarily choose. Either they were volunteers or they were planted when the site was basically used by one developer, for instance. So we can't know that. I think your examples are good. Unfortunately, I think that, you say that and the first project that's going to come in is going to be complicated because a lot of the sites that are left are complicated. So when I look at these minimum preservation percentages, my big question is, where are they coming from? So 40, 50, 60. So that's my first question. Where are they coming from? And are they actually constituting really that and observing that balance? So that's my first, and then I'm going to get into a kind of mitigation later. Yeah. So that's my first question.
Okay, so there is an element of arbitrary, choices in finding a starting ground. So like I said, I highly anticipated that you would give me feedback on these numbers, that the community and the development community will give me feedback on these numbers. These are numbers that to the best of our ability, we looked at a few different previous applications and compared, ran some numbers and tried to kind of find something that would result in a similar outcome to what we see with the discretionary track that moves us from merely considering trees, which is a very, very low bar, but trying not to go so strict that you're basically choosing trees over development. So this is just staff's best educated guess at a starting point on the percentages. And because we're balancing some different things, so for the 40% and the 50% location categories, those allow mitigation. So we looked at it as, you're ending up with 20 to 25% of the actual existing tree diameter breast height amount on the site being preserved. And then the remainder can be removed or mitigated. And by mitigating, you're planting at a 1-to-1 ratio. So if you identify the tree as one of the ones that can be mitigated, then you're potentially removing a mature tree and plant, but the trade-off is you're planting a new tree that may be a more appropriate variety that will be in a location that it can work with, thrive with the development rather than be potentially impacted and could have trouble surviving the impacts of development. So the 60% in the South Hills, the reason we did the no mitigation was because allowing mitigation in the South Hills over 900 feet did not feel consistent with the South Hills study. So that was kind of the balance that we struck, and then we tested it with a few of the previous applications and compared the results that we would get with these numbers and this preservation method compared to what we actually were able to achieve through the discretionary track. It's hard when you're in the confines of clear and objective because we want the flexibility of mitigation. And as Ed mentioned, we had pursued an option of a mitigation bank that the Urban Forester's Office would run. That's not necessarily gone forever and could still happen, but it wasn't at a point that was ripe enough to wrap it in at this point with clear and objective. And also because clear and objective is such a small subset, not every application goes through this process. And so Urban Forester's Office is wanting to kind of work on that a little bit more before they consider creating something like that. But it could be plugged into this and allow another option outside
Yeah,
of mitigation or strict preservation. Have I addressed
thanks for
your?
the feedback. I can get into the details later, because one of my concerns is it's not DBH really. I mean, it's critical root zone. So all of a sudden you lay that critical root zone down, and for it to be viable, you can't impact more than 30% of that root zone. It's very, very challenging. So when I look like outside the South Hills area, it's 50% of the 40% required. That's 20%. I would say zero. I would say basically you don't have a requirement of preserving it. If you're over, mitigate it, because I'd rather see those properties developed in full capacity. And mitigation means, yeah, let's make sure trees are replanted and they're viable trees and they have to be maintained so they are living, right? They're healthy. And then I get into within the 90-foot elevation. Yeah, we've got the refinement plan. It's a little bit more challenging. I am challenged by 60% because there's no mitigation. Now, okay, they can get through a discretionary track, but if that's where we're relying on infill within our UGB, I just think more consideration might need to be spent on what 60% really means, especially as these sites get harder and harder. And what I mean by harder and harder is you've got a lot of that balance is hard to meet, right? So the 50%, if outside South Hills is zero, I'd say within South Hills, between that, okay, maybe you preserve some of them, but 50 seems quite large. So basically you're seeing where I look at in a balance, mitigation is very viable for me. And a mitigation bank is awesome. And it's why more exploration in terms of what Portland does, because it's much denser and it has a bigger urban forest. So what are they doing in order, so it's on edge, what are they doing in order to accommodate that? So that's it.
Commissioner Ramey, and then I'll go ahead and get back to you, Commissioner Baker. Go ahead.
Okay, so I have either a really dumb question or a simple one. In item 1, and I do have other questions, but I thought I'd start with the dumb/simple one. There it is. The first paragraph there, the second reference, EC 9.68 2C3. Where is 2C?
So
I'd be sure I didn't
here's
miss
2,
something.
ABC,
And then where's 3?
and
That's where I click.
that's the
wait
tree,
a minute.
all of the trees that you can select from now.
But isn't that just 3 alone?
Yeah.
Oh. So there's a numbering.
Okay, so that's,
Thank you. Thank you for catching that.
so then, so I was confused when I first read this. I didn't understand that you were talking about the sum of the DBH. I thought we were talking about trees. So once it's significant, then it's 1. and it's, the next significant tree is tree number 2, and you're saving 50% of trees number 1 and 2, not the DBH altogether. So that was my first confusion.
I'm not sure I totally followed that.
Okay,
Can you read?
Sorry. So a tree becomes significant because it's a certain DBH.
8 inches.
Right. And you save it because it's a certain size. So what I thought the preservation was about was just about once it becomes significant, then it's registered as one tree. And if you had 10 trees that were all over 8 DBH, you wouldn't be adding up the sum of all those DBHs. You'd be saying, of those 10 trees, I'm going to save half or whatever the number is. So I understand now that that's not, I thought, well, maybe it's just a language thing, but now I understand what you did. So following up on that, back to the critical root zone, is there a relationship? Because my thing is all about canopy coverage rather than individual trees. And so this seems to get closer to what I'm interested in. And I think there's some flexibility. This seems complicated on the face. I think there's actually some flexibility into it. Do we know that there's a relationship between critical root zone and DBH? Is that a yes?
Yeah, this complicated. That was the other thing I was going to bring up. This actually complicates it. Because how do you, if you've got a total
So if you have a
DBH,
big
how do
tree,
you?
Do you have a big critical root zone? Or?
Yes, it's tied to your DBH.
That
But if
sounds
you
okay.
tie them all together and you've got a total DBH, why are you looking at CRZ?
But you would only look at the CRZs for the critical root zones for the trees that you're going to preserve.
I
So the
see.
ones
you
that are
wait until you do the
removed,
I
calc
think
and
that's
you
then
don't
then
apply.
do. The ones that are mitigated, we are not concerned about the CRZ. The only CRZs that really become relevant are the ones for the preservation trees because we need to ensure that not more than 30% is impacted.
That is impacted with construction activity, right? Okay.
And to your point about like DBH and why we use DBH and are totaling it, we did toy with and looked at different methods. Under clear and objective, canopy cover is really not clear and objective.
Right.
And then we talked about like basal area, which again is kind of, it's a cross section of the trunk, and it's still measurement, so it's similar to DBH. DBH has been used, it's been consistent, and with all of the changes that we were doing, we chose to kind of stay with that, but to at least look at it as a cumulative DBH rather than the tree by tree, because otherwise you can game it. There was a 36-inch maple on that one plot plan,
Right.
that if that just counted as one of 8 trees, that's you get a different result. And so there may be benefits or pros
Either
and
way,
cons
if
to
you could
doing
game
it.
either way.
Right.
I think this is a better way to go about it. I think.
It felt
Not
more,
that I understand
it felt more equitable when we were evaluating the different ways to go about it.
So how many questions do I get before?
Go ahead.
Thank you. So 1A, item 3. Do we need to record species? This seems like a make work item. Maybe we can list that one.
here?
Common name, 1A, item 3.
I will say that is very helpful because again, we can't determine or guess after the fact what was meant to be preserved. And so it allows us to be very specific through the land use application process so that staff doesn't have to interpret which tree is to be preserved or not.
So you can identify that. It just seemed to me like that was make work. If your criteria is how big it is and whether you're saving it or not, then you're asking people to give you information that isn't, except as you say, to identify them. But aren't they identified geographically on the drawings and that? Anyway,
You can
that
have
would be my
clusters
comment, is
though,
this-
similar to like you could have a cluster of trees and
Right.
one's a fir and one's a maple and so
Maybe.
in
me,
my
this seems like maybe
experience,
this
it's helpful.
Almost tiptoeing back to the tagging idea where it may be more work than we need to get what we want to get,
Okay.
just to me. And then maybe I've used up.
We require that for discretionary, right?
I would just
Okay.
follow up that having the exercise of 0 mitigation is a good one. Because really, we're talking about 0 or we're talking about some number. So what does it look like if it's 0? Because I actually think when when Commissioner Taylor was talking, I thought, well, actually, 0 might make sense for some of these situations.
Zero mitigation or
mitigation.
zero preservation?
Zero preservation, sorry.
So allowing basically full
Right,
mitigation.
full mitigation. I mean, as a,
That's certainly
Old
something
school.
that, to me, that's kind of getting into a little bit more of a policy direction.
Right.
And that's where I would look to your
yeah,
guidance
because
on
to me, that
if
gets
you're
you
wanting to
back to
change
the tree
something.
coverage you want over time, and it allows much more flexibility to the development.
Okay. I'm going to put myself in the queue and just kind of respond. I 100% agree with Commissioner Taylor's assessment of just the difference in mitigation for different areas. I do feel that there's enough challenge with developing in some of these areas as it is without tree preservation that, I think that I would like to see the best way to develop to full capacity. So I do, and I agree with Commissioner Ramey as well. I mean, I think that there may be appropriate areas that, where you'd be able to mitigate 100%. So I would like to explore that. I also, if on number 1, subsection A, or in number 3, the common name, genus, and species, if we're not using those factors in any kind of, they aren't applicable because we're only looking at the DBH, then I'm wondering why we're going to the trouble of having someone actually have to catalog all of that. And then the other thing I will say is that I do think that that whole process then kind of gets us back to where we were before, where we're having to, assess all of the trees on a site. So I think that the feedback that I got was that it isn't as simple as it sounds to just say, oh, okay, well, we're only going to look at the ones that are 8 inches in diameter or bigger. And a lot of them, that's actually the majority as it is. And so I think that just, for me, it would be really helpful, and I know there's people in the room here that I'm hoping are hearing me, but I think it is really helpful to hear from the public and hear from the folks that deal with and have familiarity with these sites, because it really helps us make informed decisions to try to figure out the best way to account for all of these different scenarios. So I will just mention that those are some things that I got as feedback. So and then I have Commissioner Baker in the queue, and then Commissioner Borowski. Did you have anything?
Yeah,
I do at some point.
Okay.
Maybe you can put me in the queue after these two.
Okay, perfect. Go ahead, Commissioner Baker.
well, just a couple comments, and then I have my initial question really was, I think since this would be prepared by a landscape architect or a arborist, then that the reason that they use these names is because they clarify what the species is, and that will determine what the critical root zone. It varies depending on species. Some of them.
It doesn't.
No, it actually does. If you talk to an arborist, it does depending on the species. Some of them have smaller root zones and go deep, and other ones go wider. So
There's actual critical root zones that I would say that a true critical root zone assessment is best determined by an arborist in the field, and they look at drip line, and it's not clear and objective. We go by DBH, and we go by 1.5 times the DBH, and so it's for every inch of DBH, you get 1.5 foot of critical root zone.
well, that's not in this section then. So-
That's just how our code
And I was
defines
just
critical
commenting
root
on the
zone.
real critical root zone is determined by the species. So that's just the way they know the species names, and it seems a little excessive to have the species name and the common name, but I can understand because the common name sometimes is referred to multiple species, so the species name is the only one that's really unique. My other comment was this, it doesn't apply to a certain area of site. Now, we exempted sites under 20,000 square feet, but we don't have a requirement for some minimum site some site size that this has to apply to. And I'm getting ahead of myself, but, the other option, really what I'm talking about is, I guess it's
The preservation area.
C. It seems to me that the whole purpose of this was, when there aren't a lot, it's not a huge site, not 100 acres, that you would require this method rather than the sort of guess by, the landscape architect, it just seems a little crude to do that on smaller acreages. And so you would have a stipulation that this C2, 2C would apply only over a certain area you could use that. Couldn't be used arbitrarily on a 20,000 square foot lot.
Right, the way it's set up now, it would apply if you're over 20,000 square feet
Seems
or in the South Hills
doesn't
study,
make
no matter what.
sense. It seems like if it's under some certain area, then you have to use this method, and you can't use the other method. The whole purpose of the other method was for large sites where we didn't feel it was going to be too costly to inventory thousands of trees, right? But if you're talking about a dozen trees or 24 trees, it doesn't seem to be like, to me, that would be onerous, and it does do a better job of doing what you want, which is.
I think there's less incentive on very small infill sites to use the preservation area, because I think that is more beneficial to really large sites that have really dense forested areas where they can set aside a chunk. And it's similar to what we see most common in the South Hills area, and where we had the standard that was a 40% preservation, open space preservation that often overlapped with the tree preservation requirements because they would create the 40% open space areas to encompass a lot of the tree preservation areas. So the idea was going kind of along that line. We had talked about doing an option that was basically set aside so much percentage of the development site, but then it was difficult to tie, if they were to devote 30% of their development site to preservation, it's difficult to make sure that there are actually trees in that 30% of the development site. And so that's why we went with this approach on the tree preservation areas, with a certification from an arborist or a landscape architect that there were enough trees preserved to meet the requirement.
Yeah, I would feel more comfortable from a clear and objective standard that there be some, differentiation, some area dimension that would separate when you could allow that third option. I wouldn't want to get a situation where the arborist is used all the time just to save a little money on the process. And it isn't quite as clear and objective based upon, our goal would be to, based upon this method one, so that's my perspective, concern about that.
Mr. Borowski.
Thank you. It seems to me, we're in clear and objective, and math works real well with clear and objective. But I kind of think that trees are more poetry than math. And so we're in a little bit of a quandary there. I agree with some of the other comments that the commissioners have made, and I am looking forward to hearing from the professionals who have to deal with this code and get houses and places for people to live built and see what their input is. One of the questions, though, I did have in this section was, if we go down to section B, it says you need to have, and B number 3, the location of all existing and proposed development on the site. I've seen lots of subdivisions where lots are put out, but all the development isn't put on those lots. And in the past, it wasn't required that you had all your site plans for every single lot. And it seems like you're asking for that here. Is that something that's new, or?
I think this is because this isn't just land divisions. So for land divisions, the proposed development that's actually happening at the time of land division is creating parcel boundaries and creating lots. So that would be the development. For a site review or a conditional use permit, we do show development. That is more akin to a building permit review, if you will.
So I'm just taking, for example, when we were looking at Capitol Hill, okay, so Capitol Hill had lots, but it didn't have the buildings footprints on them. So this is
That would
saying,
be, not change that.
so why does it say you have to have the location of all existing?
They're not proposing, if they're not proposing development as part of the subdivision or as part of that planned unit development, then they don't have to show it. It doesn't say all future development, at some point. It's what are you proposing right now as part of this land use application? And for a land division, they're not proposing any houses. They're proposing to do a land division.
So then when would, I guess I'm just not clear, again, in the process here. So somebody comes in for a PUD, and they say, we're going to put 10 lots on this 4 acres, or 3 acres. And there's going to be a road here, so that's part of it. You're going to say the road, and that's going to be part of the tree. But none of the buildings would be considered as far as where they're going to take trees out of? It would only be the roads and the easements?
Not that they would need to show. So we would need to see all of the development that is occurring as part of the land division process, which doesn't include actual development of the lots that are created as part of the land division. So it's kind of a two-step process. So at the point that you're going through these standards through a subdivision or a planned unit development, the proposed development is putting in streets, whether those are public or private. It's putting in utilities. It's putting in, it's then, creating parcel boundaries or lot boundaries. And so unless they're choosing to show us future proposed development, we wouldn't be requiring that from a straight land division.
But those pictures that you showed us, when you were saying, okay, we're going to keep this trees and this trees, that had buildings showed on it.
That particular subdivision was an infill development that had existing buildings on the site. So correct, we do expect if there's a subdivision and there's a house and a garage and a shed, we do have them show those on the site plan.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Anybody else on? I do have one other comment that I meant to make. It's just more of a comment because I know that it's really hard to find a clear and objective way to deal with this. But I know in the past, and many of the appeals that we've had, we've seen professional expertise vary. And that would be a concern is if we were relying on a landscape architect or an arborist to certify that the criteria has been met, and then you have someone else with the same qualifications that would disagree. I think that would be my concerns because I think that that's what clear and objective is intended to try to remove. But that's stuck out as something that anytime you have professional expertise that you're working with, that can vary. So
I would love to solve that, but I don't think it will be solved with clear and objective.
yeah, just want to put it out there. Okay, so are we ready? Oh, Commissioner Baker, do you want to? Well, I just want to make sure we're staying within the section that we're discussing right now, so.
Just a quick comment. That's why I'm in favor of this certain area that you have to use this method, because I think this method, you couldn't really argue if you knew that there's a tree there and it's a certain diameter. It's not something you can, one landscape architect can argue with another one. Whereas if you just say 50% of the, or whatever, we say the other method allows you to have this arbitrary method that's just determined by a signature by a professional, then it's not as clear and objective to me. But I can see the reason that you would want that for large sites. So you have that, but you make it stipulated that it's only allowed for certain, minimum size sites.
All right, should we move on? Everybody okay with that? All right, thank you.
Okay, so, and I think I figured out that citation, if I could circle back to that for a second. The 2C3, if you come here, this is C, the preservation requirements. And so the 2 isn't this 2 down below, it's the 2 that starts off the tree preservation standards. So you go from that, I'm going to scroll up and hopefully not make anybody sick. So here's our parentheses 2. Then you go down to subsection C, tree preservation requirements. And then you go down to, there's 1, then there's 2, and then you go all the way after the table and you get to 3. So that is actually an accurate citation, and it is referencing the tree preservation area alternative because that doesn't require the tree preservation and removal plan. This is especially with this large table and the breaking it up, it's a little hard to follow your thread through it. Okay, so subsection 2 gets into the mitigation. So an applicant can elect to mitigate a portion of the minimum preservation of significant trees on the development site. And then this is where we make it clear that for locations below 900 feet in elevation, the applicant may mitigate up to 50%. Again, 50% is a starting point number, and that's something that I expected would be talked about by you, talked about by in public testimony, and that we'll need to find the right, kind of the sweet spot. Then subsection B clarifies that it's not available for significant trees located on portions of the site over 900 feet, or at or above, I should say, at or above 900 feet elevation. And then subsection C gets to talking about the ratio and the minimum. It stipulates that they need to be 2 inches for deciduous trees or 6 feet in height for evergreen trees. And then this table goes along with this section. And this table, one of the things that we had heard about was the first draft of the code had a very limited table. It was only native tree species, and something that came up a lot in discussion was the desire to make sure that this is taking into consideration climate change and changes in the ranges of species that are both here and maybe won't do as well as species that aren't necessarily naturalized here yet, but that are anticipated to become naturalized. So this list came from the Urban Forestry Office, because they're currently doing a similar reevaluation of the approved street tree species. And so this was a curated subset of species that they felt were readily available, and because that's another thing, they're big, they have a giant list, but it has a lot of cultivars that are difficult to actually find in the nurseries. So these are species that we expect should be readily available to applicants, and just opens it up as much as possible to provide a lot more flexibility in terms of those replacement plantings and what species that you can use. And it takes up about 2 pages. But that's kind of the crux of the mitigation section. Any questions on that?
Okay. Commissioner Fragla was in first, and then Commissioner Taylor, Commissioner Ramey, and Commissioner Baker.
So my question does relate a little bit to some of the conversation we've already had. For example, Commissioner Taylor's comment on what 100% mitigation might imply. So and you also referenced that this clear and objective would be very similar to the discretionary track, to the outcomes that we've seen from the discretionary track. So I'm really curious what the discretionary track says. For example, for locations below 900 feet, for locations above 900 feet, is mitigation allowed on the discretionary track? Can somebody mitigate 100% on the discretionary track? I mean, I'm not sure if we want to be creating a clear and objective approach that is the same as the discretionary track, right? So we want developers to have 2 options, and one is much more defined, and then the discretionary track should have more flexibility. So
Yeah, and it's a little dangerous to compare the discretionary track with the clear and objective, because clearly they are 2 separate tracks,
Right.
and there's a reason the discretionary allows more discretion. It also means that through the discretionary track, you definitely get a wider range of outcomes, whereas the clear and objective is going to be more prescriptive just by, it's inherent in the clear and objective requirement. And so the example that I showed you of that 6-lot subdivision, there was the one fir tree that was the only tree on the site that was actually designated as preserved. And so the remainder of the trees were in essence mitigated, because there were some mitigation requirements for the undeveloped lots to plant additional trees, but then the other trees weren't needed to be saved. So it wasn't necessarily as methodical as going through the clear and objective approach, but it was a similar outcome, but certainly with more mitigation, I would say. And I think that's I don't have strong feelings on this number. This was a starting point, because it is really difficult to create something that's super prescriptive, that's modeled after something that's highly discretionary. And under the discretionary track, there's guidelines about where to prioritize tree preservation and everything, but when it comes down to it, you have more flexibility to make the argument that the development doesn't allow for the saving of trees under the discretionary track more so than this would have under the clear and objective. So that would be an argument, I suppose, in favor of upping the mitigation allowance, at least in areas where you're comfortable with that. My personal feeling is I get nervous over 900 feet. That's the part that in all my 2 years almost now in being in clear and objective and digging into the South Hill study, that feels like kind of that's where the ridgeline and the view shed area is most impactful. And so and it's also where most of our heavily forested areas are. So I would consider, if you allow mitigation, maybe not 100%, or maybe stick with the no mitigation. But in the other two areas, I think that's a decision that you guys should discuss and potentially amend what we're saying. And you may want to wait until after you hear public comment. I mean, if this is an okay starting point, I'm not coming to the table saying, oh, I've got the best code written and, and it's perfect. It's not. I feel like it's a really good starting place, and it gets the discussion going, and it allows for you to hear responses on both sides, because I'm pretty sure you're going to hear it's not enough and it's way too much. And so I'm looking forward to working through that and finding that balance as much as we can through this process.
Thanks. Commissioner Taylor.
Yeah, I have a couple items. So one thing, just to make sure, and maybe you understand, Commissioner Fragala, but I think I just want clarification. These standards are actually in the general development standards. These aren't, is that correct? These aren't clear and objective for just clear and objective path. These are the standards that are going under the general standards section.
They're in 9.6885, which the 9.6000s are considered general development standards.
So these do apply to both clear and objective and discretionary.
Okay.
Well,
Well,
discretionary.
discretionary
where-
doesn't point to this section.
Yeah.
Okay, so just in terms of discretionary, that's what I was going to go to. So what's the criteria of discretionary? Does it point to this section?
No.
They're built into the discretionary criteria.
And have you guys looked at that criteria to make sure that it doesn't, you know how there's that catch-all at the beginning of discretionary, and all other code standards that apply? My concern is this is under the general. So typically what happens is then you comb through the code and you're looking for all applicable. So unless that criteria, if it stays silent, you're actually forced to meet this.
Double check that.
We can double check
Yeah,
that.
so I'd explicitly say this does not apply. Otherwise, you've got a loop that you just went into, right? So, so great. That was one of my questions for clarification. The other is 2A. I mean, I would like to hear more from the public, and right now, I haven't done detailed research. I have done projects. So for A, I would actually have you can mitigate 100%. I mean, I'm going back to kind of that perspective. I do think you're challenged by clear and objective to have no mitigation at all above 900 feet and no option for adjustment review, to me, is I don't think it's what we want to maintain the rest of the balance we're talking about. You've got developable property, people own, yes, in a sensitive area. There are a lot of other requirements. Besides, the professionals, they don't want to design something that's going to slip down, then you got liability issues, right? So, okay, let's assume you've got a team and they want to have an effective, successful project. And that also means constructability, durability, et cetera. I look at mitigation, and is there a way to have 3, 4, 5 criteria? You can mitigate it if these things apply and make them really clear and objective, like a street. So mitigation can apply under certain circumstances and kind of reach out to the community of professional people that handle this more often, do these PUDs in the South Hills. What are those exceptions that mitigation makes sense? Because you also don't want a bad design, and you don't want completely undeveloped area when we're relying on that residential inventory on those properties. So it's just an idea so that you're not at 0-0 with no option. Because we've just actually not made, we haven't balanced anything. We've actually decided as a jurisdiction, as an at-large committee, that we've decided that is a place for trees above 900 feet. Is that what we want? Because essentially, if you boil it down, that's kind of what we're saying is, in a place where balance is needed, we're prioritizing 100%. We're prioritizing the trees. So can we get, is there another option? Yeah, so that's it. And the other thing, one more, sorry. Remind me again, in clear and objective, you can allow adjustment, because all of a sudden the adjustment goes to discretionary. So maybe there aren't 3 options under the actual standard. If people are feeling really nervous, you've got the other part of it, some feedback saying, yeah, we're really concerned about this. Maybe under the adjustment review, you add an additional criterion that addresses sites above 900 feet. So it forces discretionary. I'm just looking for an option. Where's the mechanism? Which for me is, I think, one of the best things the city of Eugene does. Is if you want good design, if we want balance, we recognize this is a sensitive area, you have to go through discretionary, here's the criteria. So, there.
Good question.
Yeah.
I would just wonder if that's allowed in the statute, because I think
We've done that. There's definitely clear and objective standards that have an adjustment path, and we've definitely made that clear that we're not forcing people to choose an adjustment review, which would be not compatible with the statute. But if somebody chooses to open themselves up to a discretionary review optionally, then that's okay.
Commissioner Ramey, go ahead.
Yes. So during the mitigation process in item 2C, each significant tree at the time of planting, trees used for replacement, no, that's not it. Upon removal, there's the phrase I'm looking for. So I was trying to understand what the timing of the replacement tree was. So it's upon removal, then the trees. Then what I'm looking for then is, what is the protection of that new tree to be sure it doesn't run afoul of all the other things we're protecting the existing trees from? That's one. The other question is, how long do they have to keep the new tree alive? And is there any standard in there about that?
I believe in the general standards, under the landscape standards, there's a 5-year, there's a requirement to ensure that they're watered and that they're kept alive for, I think it's a period of 5 years. Does that sound?
I think so. I don't know if that, and we're sure that applies here.
Well, it's a 96000.
So that's my question. So you've done a mitigation, you plant this new tree, and then you drive over it with the tractor. Well, so it just seems like that protection should be in place for the new tree. I've seen it many times.
Sorry, I know. It almost makes you think that.
I'll look into the, Well, and we do have, yeah, the very end that we haven't gotten to yet. Is there anything about
No.
the 5 years there?
No, or mitigation trees, so that may be an.
Originally had this
Okay.
note in my.
Sure. And I'll look at into that and see if the landscape standard requirement, because these are required plantings, it's possible that that covers it, but I'll make sure that there's a connection there.
Commissioner Baker, you were in the queue. Commissioner Beeson, were you?
Yeah.
You know, just briefly, I'm kind of waiting until we go through this. I have a couple overall comments I want to make.
Okay.
So maybe I'll continue to I just want to be sure we don't run out of time.
Not a problem.
Okay, thanks.
Commissioner Baker?
Yeah, a couple of things. Reason I talked to the urban forester was I wanted some more detailed supplemental information on replacement trees to get an idea of if we're asking the right number when we say replace one tree with one mitigation tree. So I got this information, so just, for people to note, the wholesale cost for like a 2-inch diameter deciduous tree is $100, and an evergreen is about the same. And they actually estimate, that's the wholesale cost, but they actually estimate the cost of replacement tree planting, irrigation, and maintenance for 3 years is $480. And then I wanted to compare that with what the urban forestry folks consider the value of these trees. So I used 2 different numbers. One is the 8-inch diameter. I got some estimates based on some appraisals that they had recently done. And then also the number they use now is really the number on the very bottom of that, that's per square inch of DBH. And I just want to point out that, a replacement tree that maybe costs $500 for planting and keeping it alive is typically replacing a tree that's worth thousands of dollars in terms of its value. And the values are including, and the reason that I think there's an issue and why there was some concern about the higher elevations is you want to maintain hillside integrity and strength. That's one of their criteria that you list here, but they also list others: carbon sequestration, heavy metal uptake, air pollution reduction, habitat value, water quality filtration, erosion prevention, and hillside integrity. And then you have aesthetics and property values. But the point is that there's a lot of value that the tree adds, particularly if it's a larger diameter. And if you want to mitigate that, it may make sense to think about that one-on-one, because, the mitigation is a $500 thing, and we're taking away, a minimum of several $1,000s worth of value.
Can I ask you a question, Commissioner Baker? Do
Yeah.
you know who is the value to? Do you know? I mean, when you say the value of, a ponderosa, 25-year-old ponderosa pine is worth $2,000 to whom?
Well,
The
for example,
landowner, as lumber? I mean, I'm just
no,
curious
it's-
where they
it's-
came up with the value number.
those values are the values that the urban forestry considers the value of that tree, and it's also the appraised value. If you take out a city street tree, they will do an appraisal of it, and that's what you have to reimburse them for when you take out a tree that's of a certain age and certain size and so forth. So those are general numbers used by urban forestry departments. That's all I was told. Again, we could ask them for more detail, but that's not aesthetics or property value. That's just the general number that they use for the value of a tree. And it's by DBH square inches. So it goes up very fast with diameter. If you're looking at, you can get a $15,000 tree with a 16-inch diameter. So to me, that caused me to consider whether they can plant a tree wherever they want when they mitigate it. They aren't required to plant it could be in the front setback. It could be, between lots, So there's flexibility there, but if we're trying to get a more equal balance, I mean, it's not going to be equal, we're still going to be very unequal. We might consider changing the number from 1 to 2 or 1.5, trees. And also, I wanted to make a comment. This large approved list is useful, it's very interesting, but there are a lot of trees on here that will never get to anywhere near to 8 inches in DBH.
Which that I'm aware of that, and part of that is, and I think Commissioner Taylor's kind of spoken to this, that a lot of times, if you're taking out a 36-inch Doug fir and you're developing, it may not make the most sense to plant another very large evergreen tree in that location, and so, and depending on the level of the development, you may want some smaller varieties and stuff to be an option. So again, it was our attempt to build in some flexibility around variety and type and species that can be chosen to fit the needs of the proposed development, not just completely replacing, something with the identical thing that'll, the identical species that'll grow up and replace it.
I'm not suggesting that, it seems to me that it's, when you have a vine maple that might max out at 2 to 3 inches in diameter and go to 10 or 12 feet, it's not quite the same as a tree that has more value.
For what it's worth, I didn't mark these on here, but I did have, we have an in-house arborist as well, and he looked through the list, and I think there were 3 varieties on this list that are small, like the vine maple being one of them. So there's not like a lot of selection that is not considered a medium to canopy tree.
Right. I didn't want to see someone take these standards and then we end up with a bunch of lots with, these teeny little vine maples, mitigating larger trees. So, I don't know how to deal, think about that. Maybe those ones should be, I don't know, considered for removal from the list.
I want to keep us moving. Does anybody else have questions on this particular section? And
I just want to add, I look quickly, I know you'll do your homework, but I think Commissioner Ramey's idea was good. I looked through, there is the maintenance, but it doesn't have specificity, and the 5 years is actually embedded within each of the individual standards, L1.
Okay.
So, yeah, I would look into that.
So we could add some language here.
Yeah.
And is that that 5-year kind of window, it'd be easy to just take the language and put it in here. Okay.
And you can put it under that maintenance section that's already under tree preservation. Because that's pretty, it just says, make sure a car doesn't run it over, anyways. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you for catching that and looking into that.
okay,
Okay, are we ready to move off of mitigation?
sounds like it.
Okay, so the next one is the tree preservation area alternative. So this is subsection 3 on page 5 of the attachment B. So again, this is the 50% was just a starting point, and it really was kind of picking the middle of the road because we're not looking at the location category on this and providing different requirements for different areas. We're looking at the development site more holistically, and to kind of layer the requirement that way seemed more problematic with the preservation area, and this is an attempt to provide another more flexible option. So as a starting point, we picked 50% of the total existing DBH on the development site to be preserved within 1 or more preservation areas. The preservation areas have to be delineated and shown on a site plan submitted for approval, and they need to encompass the entire critical root zone area for all of the significant trees preserved to meet the required minimum 50% preservation requirement. So there would be a little analysis on the fringe, again, assuming a very large site, you might have very large stands of trees that could be preserved. And so you may not need to evaluate all of the trees within the stand, but the ones along the fringe would probably need to have a critical root zone determination made so that we could right-size that preservation area. And then the applicant would provide a written certification, again, similar to geotechnical, just stating that at least 50% of the total existing DBH was preserved by those preservation areas. And then subsection B was just the mitigation is not allowed. So if we're changing direction on that, then that would potentially impact subsection B.
I have a question I'll ask, and then I'll, Commissioner Taylor and then Commissioner Fragala. So if, just hypothetically speaking, if we reduced the mitigation to, 100% could be mitigated, would there then be a need to evaluate the trees? Because if you can mitigate whatever you need to, then would there be a reason to have to go through and catalog them at all for any? Does that make sense? As I'm looking at this and I'm reading through it, it's just, I see lots of costs that are built in to the need to just have to count everything and factor in what you've got, what you're looking at. And if suddenly in certain areas below a certain elevation or so, you could mitigate 100%, one for one, or whatever, then suddenly would that remove the need to be going and counting all the trees and whatnot and determining which ones need to be preserved, which ones don't need to be preserved? So I guess that's just kind of a general question. Like, what would that look like? Does that make sense?
Mitigating and the preservation area are not as compatible, in my opinion. I think that maybe some mitigation but the idea is that you're preserving kind of a natural area, as opposed to you're creating lots and there's a tree back here that needs to be preserved and fenced off and not impacted. So I guess I'm trying to think about how mitigation would play into this, and also the concern about this being used in the South Hills area, and if there was complete mitigation, I just don't know that would get enough public support to mitigate 100% of the trees in, certain areas of town.
So I have Commissioner Taylor, Fragala, and then Commissioner Borowski.
So once again, I just think I'd love to see more feedback. I like this alternative. I think the 50%, once again, I would look closer at it. I do, once again, I'm trying to achieve that balance, and how do we allow, so we're looking at it truly in a balanced way. Mitigation, what I look at is, let's say you have a very viable preservation area, which is not uncommon, especially in some of the larger sites where you have stands of trees. And let's say in order to get this percentage, which you said to some degree is arbitrary, you've got 2 trees that actually the critical root zone impacts some critical part of the proposed development, right? So you want to keep that, yet there's some area on the other side of that area that you could mitigate it. You still maintain the stand of trees. So I don't know, I just think, because you could have a viable area, I'm just thinking in terms of if you've got an ability to mitigate to make an area more robust, you've got some I don't want to use that. You've got some significant trees in locations that maybe are less viable. Why don't we say that? And you've got an open space area. You're creating this lovely open space with this stand of trees. And those 2, actually, the critical root zones impact the development where you're pushing into this lovely thing. I'm just trying to kind of have you think about what are those design challenges when you're there. So we just preserved 2 trees. We pushed into that area, maybe remove it. So you basically designers are balancing too, in order, and that's really, it's a problem-solving effort in balancing. So not having mitigation, once again, I'm concerned about that. So is there a way, once again, is there an adjustment review option? Is there something that allows more flexibility so the greater intent is met for an overall balance? That's really it. The other thing I wanted to directly kind of talk about what Commissioner Edwards brought up, it's interesting. So I'm going to talk about just my experience. If you've got these developments, typically you're going to get a survey so you can understand what those development parameters are. Those survey, you're not getting it into common name plus species and genus, but the trees are going to be identified. The DBHs are identified on surveys. So most of the time, for instance, our firm, we want to, and our client, they want to preserve existing trees. That actually adds value to their development, but not at the expense of the other balancing choices that are being made, right? So identifying those, but if you had 100% mitigation, for instance, and you still have to do a tree preservation and planting plan, this is kind of something that from a developer standpoint, they're doing anyways, yet it's a really good question. If there's 100% mitigation, you have a survey, maybe not as much information is needed. So that's if we go to zero preservation, especially in certain areas. Yeah.
Commissioner Fragala.
Since we're looking at alternatives in this section, I'm really curious about the mitigation bank that you recommended. And you said we're not quite ready to approach that. I mean, where are we with that? Is that something we would build into the clear and objective code as an alternative? I'm just really curious about it.
There was a lot of discussion between us and Urban Forestry Office, and because that would be a program they would need to create, they would need to administer it. It's a big lift to get that established, and the timing isn't right for them yet to do that work yet. And because, again, this is kind of a subset, and I think that their vision of that program would be bigger. And so we basically got to a point where we really need to get clear and objective, cross the finish line, and get these code amendments refined and hopefully passed. The timeline just didn't work for them to be able to commit to creating the program and running it and finding funding until it was self-sufficient and stuff. So it was just a logistical disconnect, if you will. And so, but there's a lot of positive energy around the mitigation bank. So I'm hopeful that will come around again, and that's just more a parking lot issue now, and not it didn't work and it's never going to happen.
Do you have examples of where that's being used that you might be able to share with me?
I know that there's one of the urban or parks and open space or urban forestry. I'm not sure which area they're in, but there is somebody who came from, I believe it's North Carolina, where they have had a incredibly successful mitigation bank, like almost too successful. And so that's when I haven't looked exactly at that mitigation bank program that they had, but that's one that the Urban Forestry's office has talked about.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Commissioner Borowski.
Yeah, I think, again, your example of a large development site and it's got a nice pocket of trees and you can get 50% of your DBH in that pocket of trees may happen and can happen on certain sites. But then I think there's also going to be a lot of large sites where you're not going to be able to get to 50%. I mean, to get to 50% may take 50% of the site. That would be my concern. If you got a 20-acre site and you've got trees all over it, and there's no form of mitigation. Let's say you've got a clump that you can get to 30%, but then the next 20% is going to take another 6 acres. That would concern me. I mean, again, we're getting into the not being able to mitigate. So let's say you had a nice chunk of trees and that got to 30% of your DBH. Is there a way to mitigate that other 20%? Something like that. You still get the the cluster and the nice open spaces, but you're not taking up a huge chunk of the development site. Because I'm concerned that your scenario sounds great if there's a big stand of trees and the rest of the property is not big stands of trees. But if the whole development site has trees all over it, I don't think this scenario is going to work. So that was just one of my concerns. And I don't know what the mechanism for mitigating would be, but I just see your scenario as working in specific places, but maybe not generally working. And so that's just my concern.
I do want to make one quick point. If you recall, the existing clear and objective PUD requirements had some significant land, some provisions that were really highly impactful to the amount of land that could be developed for housing versus preserved for other reasons or whatnot. And so this felt like a bit of a trade-off with some of the other requirements that we're letting go of, but that we also said that we can let go of those because even though there's the South Hill study that applies and we need to stay consistent with it, in part because we are going to be more strict about tree preservation in the areas, where the South Hill study talks about keeping the natural character and preserving natural resources. So just something I just want that to be a little bit of background information that played into that 50% number. And I definitely think that there's room to adjust this. There's room to add mitigation or an adjustment review option. The other side is this is why we have 2 tracks too. So there is still a discretionary track where if it's possible that there are sites that maybe this wouldn't work in, and that's enough to make the discretionary track more viable. The discretionary track is supposed to be the flexible track. Not that I don't want to refine these, and I'd want to find I'm not trying to defend the 50% number or that we're right on the mark yet. And I think that this discussion, and again, when we get feedback from the broader community, that will be really helpful to determine that. But just remembering that it's easy to kind of get, oh, well, we need to make this perfect to fit everything. But this is one of 2 options. And if there's a site that really, truly requires a lot of discretion, that we do have the discretionary track.
Commissioner Beeson.
And I still have some general comments at the end, if I can. In terms of this, I spent quite a bit of time kind of looking at this, and I got a bit hung up on the tree preservation area alternative, trying to figure out, well, how does that exactly fit? And I think what was working for me was the idea that if you could have some specific development area here in the city with some sort of a natural area, some configuration that you were looking to preserve, and this might work there. And what became key was that the way that you structured this overall is we weren't allowing for any mitigation. And you were going, and so that kind of was what making it work for me. As I listened to the discussion, and I'm finding myself more intrigued with the idea of mitigation as it's talked about, but it seems like I may miss some of the nuance of this, but in general, if you were to add mitigation to this, it kind of begs the question of why wouldn't you just take it out and just say, gosh, if you're going to a developer coming in and doing something, you've got a whole section here for tree preservation and removal plan, and given we need a lot of input, we're going to have to tweak all these percentages, we're going to have to get it right so it works. But it seems like it kind of questions why you would even have this section at all, because it would, your tree preservation and removal plan area, I think, would cover it. So it's just a comment.
Okay. Anyone else? Oh, Commissioner Baker, you had a comment on this section.
Again, just reiterate my concern that I feel comfortable with this without with mitigation not allowed, because it provides a clear alternative to the other method. If you don't want to go ahead and count trees and figure out what's really there, and just want to get somebody to give you a general idea, then So I'm comfortable with the mitigation not being allowed. I also still think that this should have some minimum area that it would apply to, so it doesn't get applied to, like we have a cutoff at 20,000 square feet, then there's some cutoff at which this cannot be used. And again, because it doesn't differentiate between elevations, that's why, to me, that felt comfortable without the mitigation. I wanted to make the comment, too, that one of the concerns with the mitigation bank is that you take trees out of the ridgeline area, the higher elevations, and you plant them down along the river. In other words, that you have this mitigation bank, and that's where the money gets spent for wetlands or trees in other areas. And yet, what you really want is trees up in these higher areas to stabilize the slope and minimize erosion, and the number of benefits you get by having trees up there. And that was one of the limitations with mitigation bank, is that you can't really specify, unless it's well structured, which it hasn't been, where those trees would be planted.
We actually did, in talking with the urban forester, when we were kind of imagining how this would work, we talked about that, like the connection between if you were mitigating and planting, way across town from the neighborhood that lost, so to speak, lost the tree, then urban forestry has locations all over the city that could use plantings in public right-of-way or on parks and common, public open space areas. So they felt that they could make a connection to, keeping the replanting within a certain distance or something of the, so I just wanted to make sure that was clear, that is something that can be addressed. And there's some triple bottom line kind of equity reasons to maybe also redistribute some of the tree wealth around Eugene a little bit. So I could make an argument for either side, to be honest, but it's a moot point at this time.
All right, so,
We haven't done. Just one more
We haven't
no, I
done
know.
part 4.
I know. I just want to, did you have a
Yeah, just
comment
one
on
quick
that?
question. Would it be possible to write into the code under mitigation banks that if a mitigation bank, if we can get into the code now that says upon Eugene enacting a mitigation bank, that would be an option, so that we wouldn't, so it's written in now, because I know how hard it is to go back and rewrite code once it's written. So if there's a way to say,
She tried not to come up to the top.
Lauren Summers, Assistant City Attorney. Commissioner Borowski, great question. And that is something that staff definitely struggled with in thinking about, was there a way to kind of create a placeholder for the mitigation bank? And in terms of planning staff's discussion with urban forestry, my discussion with everyone, it was seemingly too difficult to try to draft around something that we didn't know the contours of. But we did try. We thought about it.
that's fine. I just thought, like I said, going back and reopening cans of worms is very difficult, and that may, if we got it in there, it may make it move along a little faster. Was what I was hoping.
Yeah, and we thought about that as well. And the other thing that I would add is, in terms of staff discussion, and Janessa mentioned this already, I think that conceptually, it makes a lot of sense that if a mitigation bank becomes a real thing, it would be conceptually relatively easy to plug it into these standards. It will, of course, require another land use adoption process, which is a relatively onerous process. But in terms of drafting and a conceptual plug-in, it seems like something that makes sense.
Thank you.
Let's move on, protection standards.
Okay, so this is kind of the final section of this. And the protection standards really are just codifying notes that we commonly require to have applicants place on the final approved site plan. So this was just making it very clear that we have the ability and authority to require that these notes that then get implemented and regulated at the time of building permit, to make sure that these are on the final site plan, so that we can make conditions of approval to add these notes.
Taylor, sorry.
The only observation I have is this whole section gives a choice between a certified arborist and a landscape architect, and here it's only a certified arborist. This entire section is exclusive to an arborist.
Which typically on the dead, diseased and dying, I believe it does need to be an arborist.
So you just, if that's the case, you're gonna wanna bring that up, I mean, publicly, definitely, but the rest of the section then becomes questionable. So you've got the ability for two professionals to address it, yet in here, it's only an arborist. So I would just get clear about what your intention is and make sure there's consistency, and then and then maybe talk to other professionals to see what the validity is.
Okay. Yeah, we'll talk about that too and find out, because like I said, these came from notes we're currently doing, so I want to
It's
I
actually
want to
an
visit
observation
the fact
I've
that,
had in the past, just that
Okay.
there's, you know, if you're allowing a landscape architect, yet they can't do the letter. What's great is what it does is it forces a design team to hire a landscape architect that's also an arborist, if this then is triggered. So know that if that's your intention, just be consistent about it, because if a team does start with a landscape architect, because they haven't actually gotten here, or they don't realize it, now they've got a team, and they gotta hire an additional person, although the landscape architect did all the work prior. Does that make sense? And now you gotta bring another professional up to date to actually provide this piece. So just know there actually are real life kind of challenges.
And I totally understand those. And to
Yeah.
clarify, this condition usually gets triggered further down the line.
That's kind of the
And
challenge.
it's usually not, they don't usually go to the design team. It's a new property owner, they've built their house, the tree in
But
the
they can
back's not
go,
doing well.
You know, you're
Yep.
just going.
Yep.
There's some continuity, and if possible, it's great if it's intentional and you want it this way. But know that oftentimes for economies of scale, you'll see a new developer will hire the exact same team to kind of save money. So it doesn't necessarily force a brand new team because in order to stamp something, you've got to become aware of everything. So if you piggyback and use the prior team, you're actually saving money by not having that professional have to backtrack.
okay, we can look into that.
Okay.
So can I do a quick, since we're 5 minutes away, it seems appropriate that we keep our February 11th meeting, which that gives me some time to take all the feedback and comments that you guys have brought up today, and maybe come back with some answers or some, a little bit more on this, and I can add the language about the protection of the plantings. I would like to have a little more clarity, though, because we've talked a lot about mitigation and whether those are some pretty significant shifts. If you're wanting, I'm not sure where to go with that at this point, whether this is just kind of discussion and we're still okay with this being a starting point and going out to public comment and then wrapping those in as you hear about those, or whether those are changes that you would like to see me make and then come back to you on the 11th of February and do a quick revisit of those before we deal with the other 3 items.
I'll just say I'm also struggling a bit with that, because while I do appreciate some of the feedback, I also think that having a starting place, whether, this is a pretty good balance of starting place, so I'd be curious the commissioner's feedback as to whether or not we want to reset the starting place for the purpose of discussion and the purpose of, what we would come up with that would then go to the public. So I'd be really curious if anybody feels strongly about changing language at this point in time. There's been a lot of discussion about that, so Commissioner Beeson.
So I think what I read in the material and what I heard from you as we started this is the idea that we would take a look at this from a higher level, if we could, and give you some feedback on structure, give you some feedback on overall content. And I've learned a lot from a lot of the detailed feedback, and find myself in agreement with some of it and questioning some of it. But I think overall, I think what I want to tell you, as I review the material, and you also set it in a context of what you all have been doing for like the last couple of years, and this has been through quite a bit of review with public, with the Planning Commission, with City Council, and we're in a process now of moving it forward to additional public hearings, additional review, and I've heard you emphasize a couple of times, a lot of the numbers in here are draft, they're placeholders, they're starting points. So, and I've heard several people say, and I really agree, we really need to hear from people out in the community again, so I'd want to kind of reemphasize that. Given all that, I like the overall structure of this, the idea, and I think it seems to me that it's pretty workable, where you're putting in place a requirement that as development's done under certain criteria, people are going to have to come forward and put a plan together. It's going to meet certain requirements. There's mitigation allowed, and I think there's a lot of opportunity to talk about what mitigation looks like and how that might be adjusted. And I'm interested in that. And then you allow for a tree preservation alternative, which I've already said, I think I like that too, if I understand kind of where you were headed with it. One of the things that worked for me as I was going through this, I went back and went a couple of pages in front of where this was in the code, where you have kind of the initial purpose section of tree preservation. You set out, the city sets out in there, not you personally, but city sets out in there a 4 or 5 objectives for what this is all about. And it kind of touches on what I think Mr. McMahon was saying and what I heard Commissioner Taylor kind of getting to. At least one of them that really resonated with me is that we're trying to find a balance here. We all like the fact that this is a green community, or it's a community that's got some canopy and some cover. We're also inside the UGB looking, a lot of us, looking for ways to efficiently and effectively use the land for development. Again, within all the different constraints we have. And I read that in the objectives. I suggest people take a look at those. I think those objectives are all pretty clear, and I think this works for that. So there's a whole other level we're going to get to of hearing from people like, gosh, what should this percentage be? And, how many significant trees, where's the cutoff point? And on. There's a lot of that. But I'd like to hear more from the community about that. And I think, if I understand, we're going to have opportunity, maybe February 11th, but we're certainly going to have opportunities as we go through the public hearing process and everything to have more input on that. So I like what you guys have done and have brought forward. So thanks.
Thank you.
A couple things. One, I wanted to say, I know I was one of the people that was really struggling with the original proposed kind of more complicated clear and objective. I really appreciate where it's come.
Okay.
I think this is definitely, I think, very reasonable. It will be great by February 11th. I'm still struggling with the mitigation piece because I always look for, have we just tipped it in terms of balance, especially clear and objective? It's a track to actually get everything, right? And I know that's a big challenge that we're all sitting in front of. So mitigation, if done well, and that's really the critical piece, right? Where it sits, has it been done well so that a balance is achieved? And just to explore that, if before the 11th, I would appreciate that, because going to the public with none could minimize the discussion in a way, meaning it's a position that I don't necessarily agree with, so it's been drafted by us and it's going out as no mitigation. So it's not reflecting the conversation we're having here.
Are you meaning from the preservation area? The fact that
no, actually in the other section too, in terms of mitigation measures above 900.
So the 900,
Yeah,
so
so both
specifically
areas.
above 900 feet in the first option, and then under option 2, the fact that there's no mitigation.
Yeah.
You would like to see those two things.
I'd love to see, what would it look like? Can you get there? Because I do want to clearly say, I don't want to be misunderstood. An urban forest is very important. I just think it's also important to achieve these other objectives. So is there a way we can do this to allow a little bit more flexibility within that clear and objective path, if possible?
So one option would be, I think there's enough time for me to kind of draft a couple alternatives maybe that then we could look at on the 11th. Hopefully not, not take too much time on it so we can get to the other issues and wrap everything up. But I feel like those would be easy enough to kind of come up with at least some options and maybe an adjustment review option for the preservation area alternative that gets you to a mitigation allowance or something. So that still kind of, gives you the tighter ability, but kicks it up a little bit more to the discretionary in order to get the flexibility.
Yeah, and the percentage, I'm okay with it. Know that I'm going to be that person if it comes back. I do think this I would love to see more feedback.
Me too.
Yeah.
Okay.
We will, after we have the public hearing, have a chance to revisit, right?
Yes.
Okay, so we are at time, and I unfortunately can't stay. So is there anything that can't wait until we revisit this on February 11th?
Just a heads up, I won't be at the 11th, the meeting on the 11th. That's okay.
I was just going to make one quick comment that this has changed quite a bit from the earlier one. There was a lot of concern from the public about this particular issue. That's why it's so troubling. So
Well, I think
it would be useful to really, I like where this is at right now, and I think it would be useful to get feedback from the public on this before we go too far away from this, because this is a big change from what they saw before.
Okay, with that, I think everybody knows, and we'll see everybody on the 11th. I am going to go ahead and adjourn the meeting. Thank you.